Well, I'm delighted to be here with Brett Weinstein and with Heather Heining, two people that came on the cultural radar screen maybe about 5 years ago with the Evergreen State College situation, but have emerged, I think, in the last 5 years as really trenchant commentators on all sorts of aspects of the culture. So delighted you're here with us today. We'll talk about your book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, and I think lots of other issues, maybe where religion and science find some interface. But I thought we'd start with Evergreen State, and I don't want to force you for the thousandth time to tell this story. I thought maybe I could do a quick little summary for our viewers, and then I want to ask you just one pointed question about it. So my understanding is at the college, where both of you were professors, there was a tradition where people of color would voluntarily withdraw for a day from the campus, sort of to highlight the important contribution they make to the mainstream culture. But then tables were turned in 2017 when white members of the community were basically instructed, were told, you have to leave the campus for a day. You saw that as a frankly racist move, and given your Jewish background, something especially chilling to be told, you know, where you can and can't go. When you objected to the authorities along those lines, all hell broke loose, I think it's fair to say. I've seen some of on YouTube, some of the extraordinary films of the students, you know, responding to you. And to me, it was like we're not in America anymore. It's like we're in Ba'athist Iraq, or we're in Pol Pot's Cambodia or something. And I urge people, watch those videos sometime. But here's first of all, is that basically okay, that telling of the story? What am I missing?
One thing I will correct.
Go ahead.
We were not told we could not come to campus, but we were coerced into not coming to campus. There was no question the administration did not want white people on campus for that day, and they made that very clear. That has now they have now made it murky in the aftermath of this emerging in the public.
But here's the question I want to ask both of you. I've been a critic of wokeism in different contexts. What's the one thing, the most important thing you learned about wokeism from that whole experience?
I would say one has to begin to ask the question what it means for somebody to believe something. And the more iterations of this we see, the more I realize that we don't mean the same thing when we say we have a belief. And so when looking at a mob that appears to be compelled of something that is obviously nonsense, one has to ask the question, well, how did they arrive there? And you can't really have a conversation with those people. You will talk past each other if your purpose is to compel them that what they believe isn't true by your metric. So we have to recognize we're having two different conversations, and that's part of the reason that we make no progress.
Talking past each other. Heather, what's the one lesson you got about wokeism?
Boy, I'm not sure I have a one. I mean, I think what Brett said is absolutely apt. I came to question, I mean, maybe this is exactly the same thing that Brett was just saying, but I came to question every conversation that I was having about what the words that I was interchanging with people seemed to mean, and what it suggested about worldview. And you know, we had, as you said, we had both been professors for 15 years and loved it, and loved our students. And our students never turned on us, never came for us. In fact, they defended us to the end. But one of the things that you learn as an educator who really comes to know your students, who really cares about your students, is what can you know, what kinds of tools can you use to get into their brains and their pasts such that whatever it is that you're trying to encourage them to learn how to do can really land, and they can then own it, as opposed to, oh, I just have to remember what Heather was saying. Right? No. That's not what education is. So when the vast majority, it would appear, of a college suddenly turned on two professors who had been living what we thought were wonderful lives there for 15 years. What did it say about all of those conversations and relationships and friendships in some cases about what was actually underlying those relationships? And I think that's not unique to the woke ideology, that we end up betraying ourselves by saying things that aren't actually true. But I do think it allows people to be more confused about their true selves.
You know, it's interesting because the question of truth, what bugs me the most is this complete relativizing of even the notion of truth. So that even in your field, so perhaps in the social sciences or in philosophy, where there's a kind of a greater flexibility, you might say, but in math and the hard sciences, it's still maintained. Well, that's truth because you're part of the patriarchy, or you're saying that's true because you're part of the oppressive class. That when we give up on the idea of truth, we're giving up on something that brings us together, right? If we abandon truth as a value in itself, God help us. And then the second thing for me is the end of public conversation. We can't have a public conversation where truth is the criterion that we all accept and that we respect each other enough to have that conversation. Something so fundamental is broken down in our society.
Yeah.
You're in exactly the right place. This is the meta conversation that haunts everything over which we cannot reach agreement. And in fact, Heather and I began discussing the conflict over COVID policy, and at some point we realized that we were dealing with the exact same thing that we had seen over questions of patriarchy and white supremacy in Evergreen. And we started referring to it as a question of medical wokeness. And what was really taking place was we were being told that we had misunderstood something, when what we were really being told was this is not the place for us to have an open conversation. And, I don't agree that is a place that can exist, right? In a cosmopolitan society where we don't all share the same belief structure, we have to figure out how to navigate controversial issues, and we have to do it with a shared agreement that our purpose has to be to remain, as one people, to govern ourselves well, and to do the best we can in an emerging complex scenario. But we've lost that. Somehow we're not all on the same team with respect to governing ourselves.
And it's dangerous. One of the master images in your book is the campfire, which I love. A lot of good things happen around campfires, you argue, but one of them is conversation, the sharing of ideas. And I've always been struck by, I'm classically trained, so going back to Plato and Aristotle, those people, that the philosophical tradition begins in many ways with dialogue. So the Platonic dialogues, it's a conversation out of which truth emerges. My hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, the Middle Ages didn't have lecture halls so much. They had disputed questions where an issue would be raised and then all the different points of view would be exchanged. You see that in Thomas's writing. The conversational model. I don't like the move Descartes makes, the cogito, I think, the sort of withdrawal into privacy and then coming up with philosophy out of that experience. I'm a cogitamus sort of person. I mean, we think. And I love that about the campfire, right? That from primeval times, we gather around campfires. But if we lose the capacity to talk to each other in a civil way, we lose the campfire, something essential is lost.
Very much so. And this is one of the moves, if you will, that we make in the book with regard to how we define consciousness.
Yeah.
And it is not inherently a standard definition of consciousness, but we find definition of consciousness in the exchange of ideas.
Right.
That which rises to consciousness is that which can be packaged for the exchange. Yeah. And that reveals, I think, how social we are. Right? We are an inherently social organism, and all of us have private lives, of course. Right. But so I think maybe it's these two things that we have so far talked about. It is there is some underlying truth. There is an objective reality, and religion, science, art, all of these things and more are seeking an understanding of that. Yeah. And we may never arrive at it. And we may not agree on what it is, but we are all seeking it. Mm-hmm. And the woke move, the postmodern move, is at some level to reject maybe that it even exists. Right. And that's kind of that's a non-starter for conversation.
We splinter then, and conversation ends at that point.
Yeah, it ends, and that's a non-starter for then the shared experience that is at its most fundamental what humans are, is the shared experience. For instance, around the campfire.
So if I can. Try to put what you've said about the retreat into the personal thinking into our framework. There's an ebb and flow between an interactive collective consciousness and a necessarily private version. And I would argue that it's something, we have undeclared dark ages in which the exchange of ideas are not welcome. And so really, I actually have a term for it. I call the people who think independently when thinking collectively isn't allowed, keepers of the flame. And, so I think some compassion for their position has to be extended, because what happens when it is again possible for us to talk together is that those who remember how to do it because they've brought it into a less obvious space, those people jumpstart the process. And unfortunately, we are now at this moment facing a bizarre kind of dark age where in some ways we have never had better tools for interacting with each other, and it has never been less welcome that we do so. And so looking for the mechanism now to re-jumpstart that conversation, which has to start with this question that you raise, which is, do we not agree on the conversation as paramount?
And it's an epistemological issue, it's a political issue, it's a cultural issue. The breakdown of conversation at all those levels, I think, is to me, is a dire consequence of this wokeism stuff. Can I shift from wokeism, somewhat happily, to these science-religion issues? Because I mean, I'm privileged to have two scientists on, and usually we talk to people more in the social sciences or in philosophy, religion, and so on. So it's good to have scientists. And it's a major block for young potential believers. Why have you left the church? Why don't you have faith? Well, science refutes religion. Science has proven religion wrong. I'm a science person, and it's opposed to religion. So I've been on this crusade for a long time to say this is a false dichotomy. This is highly problematic. And I've said, look, the church, God knows we have a checkered history. I go into Galileo and company. But that at our best, we reverence the sciences. I mean, go back to Gregor Mendel, Copernicus himself, come up to Georges Lemaitre. I mean, some great scientists were profoundly believing people. So we love the sciences, but what we don't like, I've argued, is scientism. And I gather from your book you don't like it either. And here's my definition of it. I want to just talk about that. Mine is the reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. So the scientific method, the scientific way of knowing is absolutely valid for certain aspects of reality, but not for all aspects. And to reduce everything to the scientific is scientism. Talk to me about that. I'm just curious to know your takes on science, scientism, et cetera.
Yeah, I would. I think I have a slightly different take on scientism, but it's coincident with what you're arguing. I see much of what is passing as science as not science, because, and this is maybe just a slight tweak on what you have said, because it is easier to discuss with the public and even with other scientists that which is easily measured, that which is easily quantified, that which is easily reduced. We end up focusing on those questions. And then the mistake is we think that those are the big questions. Those are the real questions. And we sort of replace the language of the small with the language of the large, and we pretend that we've asked the big questions. And evolutionary biology tries to ask big questions, and certainly that's what we're trying to do in the book, in part to provide a toolkit to understand really some of the mistakes that humans have made in arriving at the 21st century with our era of hyper novelty, and how can we think more largely about who we are and what we are and what we can be, rather than imagine that, well, science says that what you need to do to not get, say, skin cancer is to stay out of the sun, and therefore you need to always slather yourself with sunscreen. Well, we were living for our entire histories until yesterday, evolutionarily speaking, outside. What are the chances that the sun is actually the source of a major health problem, as opposed to if you start obscuring yourself from the sun entirely, you will probably cause more health problems. It's that kind of thinking. Sunscreen is the answer to skin cancer. Sometimes in some circumstances, yes, but that doesn't feel like an actually scientific interpretation. So that, for me, is an perfect example of scientism, which comes in the language of and even the methods of science, but the correct questions weren't being asked and the right framing wasn't given to the problem.
In part, the problem is that we made our biggest early gains in science in the simple sciences. And I don't mean simple to understand. Physics and chemistry are difficult to understand, but they are the study of simple interactions. And there is a problem which comes from what we call emergence. And emergence is essentially the unpredictable outgrowth of simple things into some phenomenon that we can also study, but we can't explain exactly how it emerges from the level below. And I think most of us scientists believe in an unbroken chain of causality, that if we could see everything and test everything and had infinite time in which to do it, there aren't going to be gaps in what can be explained by the levels below, but we are permanently will be stuck without the ability to see what's in all of those gaps. So the question is, how do we even conduct science when the gaps are inherent to our being stuck at a place in space and time and stuck with, an incomplete library of knowledge and noisy data sets? And so that's one problem, which is that because what we do and don't understand is incomplete by its nature, we have to figure out how to govern ourselves even with the partial information. And then the other question is, does the factual structure of the universe tell us what we are supposed to do, right? Does it tell us something about what's good and what's bad? And there are those who will argue that it does. And then there are
problem.
It's an is-ought problem. And I think it's very neatly divided, because if we can say an awful lot about what is, and then the question is, well, if we get to choose amongst what might be, are there better and worse things on the list? And does it matter that that's either scientifically justified or not, right? We should prefer that people don't starve, for example, whether or not we can justify that on scientific grounds. And maybe we can't.
Classical moral theories have something similar. You understand the nature of a human being, and from that you draw conclusions about behavior. So here's certain behaviors, call them virtues, that lead to flourishing, and that's based upon some knowledge of the pattern by which human beings are. To me that's sort of a realist way to do it. Can I ask you, I'll put my philosopher's hat on for a second. Go back to Plato's cave. So Plato says most of us are stuck in this cave, all we see are flickering shadows on the wall. Then there's this moment of liberation. I turn from that and I see, those are just reflections of higher realities. Then I escape altogether from the cave. I go outside in the blinding sun. Then I eventually see the real things, of which those puppets were a pattern, of which the shadows were a pattern. So I go to higher levels. And the first step out of the cave for Plato is mathematics, which always strikes me as fascinating, because a scientist would deal with the world of the empirically verifiable and what I can experiment upon. For Plato, that would be, and there's no insult to scientists, it would be staying inside the cave, right? What are mathematical objects and numbers? And do they represent like these sheer intelligibilities that go beyond what the sciences can immediately measure? Is it a step to a higher dimension of being, mathematics?
I think it's a higher dimension of thinking. But I must tell you, this again gets to this question of the fundamental versus the emergent.
Okay.
We are tropical biologists, right? We go to work with our rubber boots on and a machete. And if there's one thing you can say about studying what goes on in a tropical forest, is there's no place to start. It's not linear. We don't understand how the place works, and so you can't go in and begin at the beginning. What you do is you begin somewhere, and so
you can't do it with math.
Right.
The math is there, but you can't understand it through the math.
Right. The math is revealed. Pieces of math are revealed in so doing. But I think the thing is, Plato may have envisioned the route there as starting with math, and that may be a route there, but it's not the only route there. And if you talk to scientists who do work in this extreme emergent realm, I don't think it would be intuitive that you start there. You start by saying, well, what patterns can I detect, and what do they imply? What might they imply? And then you check, and they either do or don't imply that. And so it's a start anywhere, all roads lead to Rome.
Yeah, I guess I would say I could equally well argue that the math comes last, or exactly as Brett was just saying, you start anywhere, and by some metrics, I guess, you end up at the math, but you could also equally well end up at God, right? Like you could end up almost anywhere, no matter where you start, if you start with an openness, and and really, I think, as we already talked about, just an understanding that there is an objective reality out there that you are seeking to understand, knowing that you have all of your own biases that you can never escape, and you can use methods that you and others before you have discovered by which to reduce those biases. All of these things are wondrous ways to approach it, but you can't fully escape them, and there is an objective reality. And beyond that, let's go, right? Like let's try to explore in almost any way that we can.
Whatever works and whatever we can use.
There is actually a marvelous example of exactly what Heather's pointing out in the fact that we use Linnaean classification in biology. Linnaeus didn't know anything about evolution. He was working as if the creatures were all specially created and unrelated, and that effectively God had sat down at a drawing board and was in, a particular frame of mind and designed a bunch of monkeys. And that's why they look alike, right? We now understand that the monkeys look alike for a very different reason. But the point is, it doesn't invalidate what Linnaeus was doing, which is why we still use it, right? That you can do this on the basis that the creatures are similar because of the mood of the creator, or you can do it on the basis that they're similar because they have inherited similar characteristics from an ancestor that also had them. And you end up in the same place. And I think this is the point. You definitely do start with the monkeys, right? You look at the monkeys and you do note they seem in some ways different, but an awful lot alike, much more so than the monkeys look like the parrots. And so the point is, you can go deeper and deeper, and the more we do, the more we learn about that process and the history of the creatures in question. But it wasn't invalid to start with the creatures in their full glory.
Well, that's where Aristotle started. I mean, in many ways, Aristotle is the ancestor of what you do. I mean, he was this very careful observer of things. And then he noticed these, we call them now intelligible patterns. He called them forms, right? And now how those forms emerged, we speak now about emergent patterns and so on, coming from below. But nevertheless, there they are. There they are. And can they be grasped, let's say by the mathematician, if we shift the thing a little bit, as a sheer abstraction? And I think that's what Plato saw, is that I'm moving outside of a purely empirical framework. For Aristotle, of course, form and matter are so intensely related to each other. It's closer to our, I think, way of imagining it, right? There's patterned matter that's been drawn somehow into this pattern. And the pattern does have a certain independent intelligibility, even though it's related to matter. Just help me with that, because that's the classical way of getting at some of these truths that I think is kind of reemerging in a funny way with this, all that talks about emergent patterns. It sounds to me a lot like Aristotle's form.
Well, think about astronomy, right? I mean, first you have Galileo taking a tool that was not intended to look at the sky and choosing to do so, right? Which was in and of itself, I mean, in retrospect, it's so obvious that you would do this. But, the telescope was designed to, as a tool of those who wanted to win in the market to detect which ships were coming in earliest so you could change the value of your commodity. But he points it at the sky, and if you step down that road, we get better and better telescopes, and we realize that some of what looks like stars is actually galaxies, and we study galaxies and we understand their different forms. And then, very recently, we come to understand what a galaxy even is, right? It's orbiting an ultramassive black hole. The ultramassive black hole is the right place to start the question of what is a galaxy, but it's not where you start, because we're all outside of all of those galaxies. We see the stars grouped for reasons we think they're attracted to each other, and we don't realize that there's an even more, a bigger, more shocking answer. But you wouldn't go back and say, well, the whole way we studied this is wrong, because you really have to start with the ultramassive black hole that brought those stars together. You can start anywhere, and that's sort of the human predicament. We are in one place at one moment studying an impossibly large cosmos full of the strangest phenomena, and we have limited tools to unpack them, but you know what? They're good enough.
There's also a question, more so the more into the future we get, of what tools we're using to make our observations with. And the kind of science that Brett and I have done empirically the most, as he has said, is tromping around rainforests looking at organisms. Yeah, we may have binoculars on us and we may have a little microscope back at the field station, but in general, it's using our senses as we were born with them and our brains to make sense of what we are seeing, and to, as much as possible, observe without interpretation, which of course is impossible.
Right.
But observe with as little interpretation as possible and record those observations such that then we can overlay interpretation. And if the interpretations prove to be wrong, we can go back and say, yes, but what were the observations in the first place? When we're talking about astronomy, when we're talking about cell biology, when we're talking about almost all of the domains of modern science, we are using tools that remove the human organism from the observation by at least one step.
Yeah.
And so we have put in between us and our direct observation something that we are trusting to do a job that it is telling us it is doing. And that itself is an act of faith at some level.
Yeah.
And so, recognizing where we are entrusting our observations and our interpretations to others who have made promises to us that they are doing, and their tools are doing what they say they're doing, renders the modern act of doing science rather farther removed from the human experience than it has been. And I think actually in some ways, field biology is one of the modern sciences that remains as unlimited or as connected to our original senses as originally was.
You two remind me much more of Goethe here than Newton. You know, that famous debate. Goethe looked at Newtonian science and he said, mechanistic understanding of things. I'm going to take plants and animals out of their natural habitat. I'm going to cut them up. I'm going to analyze them under bright lights, ask them my questions. And Goethe, great poet, but also a scientist, said this is the wrong way to do it. Rather, you should go out into the field and sit down next to a plant and watch it unfold, Or do the Jane Goodall, go out and be with the apes or, whoever she was studying and become part of their community and watch them. And I've always sympathized with that because to me it's much more classical. I've always felt that a lot of modern science draws its strength from a certain narrowness. That's to say, reducing the 4 classical causes to 2, the material and the efficient. More like billiard balls bouncing off each other, and so let's understand it mechanistically. Where form, we've been talking about, pattern, intelligible pattern, and then finality, that things exist for a purpose. They're going somewhere. They're about something. And we can construe that very naively, or we can do it, I think the way you guys do it, is watch things and plants and ecosystems behave, right? And they're behaving according to certain intelligible patterns that are already inherent in them. And they're after something, aren't they? They're after something. They're getting somewhere. So talk about that for me. I find that interesting, is the reintroduction of formal and final causality into the scientific conversation. Bring Goethe back.
Let me say first.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm reminded of the quote that was emblazoned atop the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology, which is where we went to graduate school, by Agassiz, who was a great 19th century naturalist.
Yeah.
And, I think he was the founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, and I believe that he came up with the idea for the ice ages, or he saw the evidence for the ice ages. What it says atop the University of Michigan Museum of Zoology is, go forth into nature, take it into your own hands, and see for yourself. And there it is.
Yeah.
And this in a museum where all of these organisms have been collected and preserved, and where people come in and look at the organisms and do the reductionist thing of trying to identify who's related to whom and what it means. But right there, we are told, we are reminded, no, go out. Go out and see for yourself what you think it means.
Yeah, go ahead. Science is the study of patterns, and patterns exist from the fundamental up to the complex, the extremely emergent. And it is quite possible to blame this obsession with reductionism for our failure to understand the bigger picture. But I don't want to denigrate reductionism too much, because really the value of science comes from a balance between this instinct to reduce and the competing instinct, which is to synthesize. And what's happened is a simple quirk of the way that we currently fund science has caused an effective coup where the reductionists have won out, and those who are engaged in synthesis, largely what's happened is the reductionists get to do synthesis as a hobby at the end of their work rather than hiring people who are actually good at it. And the quirk is just that because universities are funded by grant overhead, and because reductionism requires expensive apparatus to run and therefore big grants, university administrators prefer it over work that requires a good mind and a chalkboard. So that coup has disrupted our scientific community, but the right thing to do is not to go too far in the direction of synthesis, but to put these things back into the natural balance where they're supposed to function together.
It's indeed precisely the number of things between the observation that you're making and the human organism, the more expensive it is to do the science, and therefore the more valued it is, given the current financial model of how science is done and how universities are funded.
Can I ask you one more kind of philosophy of science question? And going back to this math and patterns question. There's a famous article, I think it was 1960, a guy named Eugene Wigner, who was a younger contemporary of Einstein and Niels Bohr and those people, high-level theoretical physicists. The article was called, the title was, The Unreasonable Applicability of Mathematics to the Physical Sciences. And he wasn't a religious man, he was a Jewish background, but not religious. But I think it's something like 8 times in the article he uses the word miracle. And he calls to mind Einstein, who said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. But Wigner's point was, isn't it actually surpassing strange that this super high-level mathematics corresponds to the world that we discover, the physical world? He doesn't draw the conclusion that I'm tempted to draw. Well, the person behind the universe is a mathematician. Galileo would have said that. Einstein seems to at least point in that direction. I'm curious from you two scientists, I know that's more physics than your area, but how do you explain the unreasonable applicability of mathematics to the physical sciences?
Well, it's interesting. I often find physicists and mathematicians they become strange around this very question, right? And I mean, really, there are sort of 2 general routes you could take. You could say, well, the universe is a very odd and improbable place, and we could ascribe that odd improbableness to some force that was up to something. Or you could go the other direction, and you could say that the math is somehow downstream of the biology, right? That obviously math isn't inherent, but the math that we do is obviously the product of human activity. And so maybe there's something in the way we conceptualize it that, of course, builds a tool that's capable of unpacking this very odd and maybe arbitrary universe that we have. But, at the end of the day, there's a question, which is, what are you going to do with the gaps you can't fill in? Are you going to obsess over them or not? And for those of us who study in the realm of complexity, if we're not comfortable saying, look, that's a gap I can't fill in, I hope it gets filled in someday and I get to know the answer, but maybe I don't. I'm going to have to become comfortable with that and not let it distract me from the part that I can unpack. And this is a little bit like that, right? I don't know. I certainly have the instinct that says this universe was not designed by somebody with intent. But I also know that if I keep chasing phenomena in this direction, that I reach a place where even in principle, there's no way to answer the question. So I can leave it as a question. I can say, I don't see what philosophical problem it solves to imagine that somebody designed it, but if somebody had, and what they had done was basically imbue the universe with laws that caused phenomena that for some reason they wanted to unfold to do so, that would work too, and I can study within that universe without having to resolve it.
But doesn't it strike you as odd? I mean, couldn't you imagine a universe that is not so highly structured in these complex mathematical patterns? Isn't it odd that it is?
Sure. On the other hand, again, one always wonders whether or not the math physics community is saying something brilliant or circular when it makes arguments, about, the Goldilocks planet effect, right? And basically the point is maybe there are an infinite number of universes that have been created, and almost all of them are mathematically inhospitable, and this one was mathematically hospitable, and it's no surprise that we would find ourselves in such a universe. And so there's an anthropic principle that could get us out of that.
That always seems so strained and special pleading to me. Like you almost have to invent multiple universes for which there really is no evidence to get around the press of this question. It seems to me, yeah, it's possible, I suppose, there's an infinite number of universes and they're all crazy and chaotic except this one. But like, even there, I don't know, it seems to me hard to explain that even if you got this one's got such massive intelligibility all through it, it seems odd that just happened,
Yeah, although, we're not in a good position to address this one at the level of the math or the underlying physics. On the other hand, we've got our miracles too, right?
Yeah.
Every time I see a hummingbird, my mind thinks
they're all in my backyard.
the only thing that makes that a non-miracle is that we have a pretty good idea where the explanations are for how it got that way and what it does. And the point is, in terms of how impressive it is, it's miracle level. In terms of whether it's made of comprehensible stuff, seems to be right through. And so, what does it need to be true that a hummingbird is a miracle level machine that functions on the basis of principles that could all be chased down? It depends. If you're a hummingbird specialist, it probably does matter. If you're a hummingbird appreciator, it might not.
And what's cool, that's a different question because that gets back to like Paley versus Darwin. So, Darwin in many ways, his great foil is Paley, who says, look, nature's like this watch that I find, this beautifully designed watch, and how could that be unless there was a designer to it? And Darwin says, well, no, I think, random genetic mutation and natural selection and time sufficiently explains it. But see, my perspective as a theologian is a plague on both your houses. I'm not really interested in that question of the mechanical design. I think the theological question, this is different, we're opening up, but is why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all? Why should a finite contingent universe exist at all? And that's the question of creation. So, as a Catholic, I have zero problem with random genetic mutation, time, and natural selection explaining how things come to be, quote unquote, designed the way they are. I have no quarrel with that. Because the creation issue is a much, much deeper, more fundamental issue of why is there something at all? Why is there nature at all in the first place? Why is there matter at all? So anyway, that's another level question, But I have no problem with saying Paley. No, that's who Darwin's more correct about that.
Well, he is, although at the risk of opening quite the Pandora's box.
Open it up.
I think the comfort that you have with genetic mutation producing the world that we see is too much.
Okay, go ahead.
And I would point out that Darwin didn't say that genetic mutation plus selection would produce this because he didn't understand the underlying genetic architecture, right?
Because he predates Mendel.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
right.
It's funny, he predates him intellectually, although they were contemporaries in terms of when they
yeah.
worked. But
Yeah.
but the point is, what Darwin described was actually a very elegant phenomenon of selection, and he didn't say what was being selected because he couldn't know. And what we have done in the aftermath of Darwin, after discovering DNA, is we have said, aha, here's Darwin's mechanism. And it is certainly a mechanism of Darwinism, but it's not the only one.
Yeah, okay.
And so what I would argue is that the hummingbird isn't the process of random mutation altering genes that alter proteins that are favored when they make something more hummingbird-like, because that process isn't powerful enough. But that there are other things where you have the reproduction, the variation, and the differential success that result in Darwinian selection being actually a much more powerful phenomenon than even us Darwinists can say.
Okay.
So anyway, I still take your point. What does it matter? Well, it depends. If you have certain purposes, it matters a lot. But for our purposes, we can say, well, the fact that a hummingbird is programmed effectively to do things that result in hummingbird genes being lodged into the future, right? That's a good enough proxy for the intent of somebody who might have created a hummingbird. That we can have the conversation about the hummingbird, and its meaning can never come up.
And maybe you will say that this is all spending time in the part of the question that you're less interested in,
go ahead.
rather than the origin. But I think the job of an evolutionary biologist at some level is to become comfortable with identifying where the black boxes are in our understanding,
Yeah.
and saying there has to be an explanation there because something goes in and something comes out, and I don't know. And sometimes it's I don't know, and sometimes it's we don't know. But there is an explanation because it happened. Because we see that A went in and B came out. And the number of places, the more emergent the questions you're interested in are, which thinking about parrots and monkeys is pretty emergent. The more places where you have to say, okay, behavior was selected for. But that also means that the physiology was selected for, the anatomy, the molecular biology, the cell biology, and all of these other steps. And at almost every one of those steps, there are a lot of black boxes. I go, okay.
Can I ask, this is like a really stupid question, but I always tell my students this, I love the stupid questions, and it's the kind of philosophical instinct. Why should things want to live? Why should things want to pass their genes on? So that's an axiom behind so much of evolutionary thinking. And we say, oh yeah, of course they do. Well, I don't know, why? Teilhard de Chardin asked that question. He was a paleontologist, but a priest in the early 20th century who was trying to bring science, and especially evolutionary science, into line with religion. And then he thought Darwin was right, but didn't say enough, because he's missing something. What is it? Why do things want to live?
Unfortunately, this leads to a philosophical abyss for the following reason.
Okay, go ahead.
It's really a version of the same question. Why are you going to take your next breath?
Yeah.
What is it about being alive that's better than
That's
not
better
being?
than not being alive, but that's a fair question.
Oh, in fact, as a question, there is nothing better about being alive than being not alive. However, as the descendants of a 3.5 billion year old lineage of things that preferred living to dying, right? It's not surprising that we at this table would be agreed that taking your next breath is the obvious move, right? We are deluded by that selection, by having been favored by an unbroken line of 3.5 billion years of survivors, right? Survivors and reproducers, that those are good things to do. But the point is that's not inherent to the universe. That's inherent to how we got here. And so why do creatures want to get their genes into the future? They want to get their genes into the future because in the word creature is the implication that they are the descendants of creatures that have done a spectacular job of getting their genes into the present.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
that goal, which is the goal of evolution, is completely banal and uninteresting. And
When you say the goal, what do you mean? The goal
of getting your genes into the future.
why is that uninteresting? What do you mean, to the organism or to the...
To us, because
Well,
it's
I'm
exactly the
interested.
same goal as that of a slime mold,
Yeah.
or a cedar tree, or a salamander. We are in that way no different from all of the rest of evolved creation,
Well,
right? But we can find more meaning.
Yeah.
Like we can find more interesting goals.
But we're talking about final causality again here. I mean, very clearly, we're talking about goals and purposes, and I want something. It's like Teilhard, taking it from Bergson and those people, talked about the élan vital. There's some kind of vital energy or some kind of impetus. It's more than just a chance of a series of events, but there's something in us, even at the most fundamental level of life, that wants to continue living. And I think that's mysterious. I think it's odd.
Well, it is odd, and it's also very easy not to look at the dark side of it.
Yeah, go ahead.
The fact is, we, for reasons I just described, act as if we want to get our genes into the future. And whether that's getting your genes into the future directly, as people with children do, or as somebody who is a community facilitator, getting your lineage's genes into the future, it's all very easily explained in this way. On the other hand, and this is where I get into trouble with colleagues who, at the very least, believe this is a topic we shouldn't discuss. But there are lots of ways to get your genes into the future that are completely morally unacceptable.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what that does is it hands us with the obvious proof of the is-ought problem, right? If I'm a creature that has my biases because I want my genes in the future, even if I can't defend that as an ultimate goal. Well, then what do I do when some of the things that will put my genes into the future best
morally
are
repugnant.
right? Like one group putting another group into gas chambers, right?
Yeah.
And so our point, and we say so very directly in our book, is that we have an obligation, having recognized that we are effectively, in some ways, very sophisticated robots that have been sent on a mission. That mission has elements that we as conscious beings esteem, and it has elements that we as conscious beings must abhor. And the point is, this is the moment. Evolution has awarded us a mind that is capable of deciding what fraction of these things we actually want, right? And we actually, on that discovery, become morally obligated to reject the genetic program.
But so where did that come from, though? So must and moral obligation. I would say they come from the intuition of objective moral value, which are a bit like objective epistemic values. So truth we talked about early on. There's something like objective moral values that are there, and it's not simply a matter of the survival of my body, or it's not just programmed into me by evolution, but they're discoverable as values. I mean, otherwise, wouldn't moral language collapse into some kind of indirect form of egotism?
Well, I find intimations of it among some of the other species with whom we share the planet.
and I buy
Right,
that.
what we call the usual suspects, the other organisms, either whom we are closely related to or in some cases not, who are long-lived and who have long childhoods during which they're learning how to be themselves, and that live in groups with generational overlaps. They are learning from other members of their families at other times in their lives, and are social and are exchanging information with one another. So we have parrots and crows and monkeys and wolves and whale and toothed whales like dolphins and elephants. And baboons, for instance, have theory of mind, right? They can actually understand that I know something and you know something, and it's different from what I know, even though we're both looking at the same object about which we're thinking this. That those intimations of sense of right and wrong, and you are a different organism from me, even though the only experience I will ever have is in this body. I won't have it in your body. It suggests to us as evolutionary biologists that the moral sense also evolves, right? That it emerges in these organisms that have a long enough time on the planet with long enough childhoods during which they're looking and learning and watching from their kin, from their families, from their friends, how to be and what it is to be right.
But so press that though, to be right and how to be, meaning what? Like how to survive more effectively, how to get our genes in the future more effectively, or to live well, to live morally well in a morally upright way, you know? What's the goal? What's motivating the process?
The problem is there are two goals, and we have to choose between them, right?
Namely?
Well, let's start from where Heather set this in motion. You have millions of different species. From our perspective, every single species on this planet, and presumably every single species that has evolved anywhere, has the same purpose. It's to get its genes or whatever stands in for genes as deeply into the future as possible, right? Having the same purpose as, malaria.
Salamander or something.
Right, it's not an honorable purpose, right?
Okay,
it's
right.
just an autopilot.
Yeah.
That process, though, has created millions of different ways of accomplishing that goal. In the case of humans, we have been given by that process a subjective experience of the world, consciousness, an ability to pool our consciousness in a very unique way, and to make decisions, to decide to actually have values rather than just automatic programming. And basically, we can now look back at our purpose and say, not good enough. We have to have a purpose that is higher than that one. And the reason that we have to have a purpose that is higher than that one is if we allow that purpose to govern, then we will end up committing genocide and rape and other things.
But why is
like
genocide bad on that reading?
Well, that's the thing, is it's not bad. If you want to start from the fundamentals of the universe,
it's not bad.
it's not bad. If you want to say, actually, how do I feel as a conscious being thinking about it? It's as bad as it gets.
So
And
why though? I just want to press that. So you obviously think it's a terrible thing. It's a morally
absolutely,
outrageous thing.
and here's
So
I think
why?
what you're getting at is
Yeah.
I am perfectly comfortable with not having an answer to that question. It's bad. We shouldn't want it. And anybody who doesn't understand that it's bad is suffering from some kind of a misunderstanding. And it's not a misunderstanding of their purpose. It's a misunderstanding of something else. And if you flip that
Yeah.
around, the question is, well, what will we do instead? The what will we do instead is important too, right? If we all agree that having a conversation like this is a cool experience, right?
good thing, yeah.
It's interesting to be part of a species that can even
Yeah.
have a conversation across the table. You can know what I'm thinking. That's
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
remarkable
Right.
capacity, right? So if that is a remarkable capacity, and it's good to have such capacities, and it allows for us to choose better things over worse things, which at least might be a real distinction, then we should want to give as many people that opportunity as possible, all
Yeah.
right? And how do you do that? Well, you have to understand what we're doing that jeopardizes the future, right? We have to stabilize our way of being on this planet, or it won't last, and that means fewer people will get that marvelous experience.
Right. I won't go too much further, but it seems like you've intuited a moral value. That's how I'd put it. You've intuited, but that's a very interesting thing, because what is that? Where's that come from? What are moral values? Why should they suddenly emerge in such a compelling way? You know, to me, they're like the intelligibilities that the physics discovers. They're like that. They're somehow in the structure of being, and we notice them. They're a pattern, if you want, but now of a different nature. It's a moral type of intelligibility. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think we can and have, and in fact, Brett has written about the evolution of morality, right? Moral systems.
Yeah.
How it is that we understand, effectively whose team we're on,
Yeah.
and how to enlarge that sense of teamness. But that is separate from saying, I believe, that the understanding of what is right and what is wrong is part of what has evolved. And, maybe so, but I guess I think the distinction where we are all going to be in agreement on this is that, as you had said earlier, Bishop, there are some questions which don't warrant scientific approaches.
Yeah,
And the answer to, but why is genocide bad?
Yeah.
We could provide a list, but I don't think we're going to emerge with an answer
Yeah.
that sounds scientific.
Yeah, and
It's-
that's
it's-
okay. I would say that's right. It's
Ex-
not a
ex-
scientific
exactly. And so,
question.
If you find us,
No, that's okay. You're-
appearing to sort of, try to move around, it's like, well, actually, I don't think either of us has ever tried to provide
Yeah.
a scientific answer
No, and I
to
think that's-
exactly, why is that good and why is that bad?
Yeah.
Precisely because part of what humans have, we would argue, evolved to be is acting on some planes that are beyond that which the particular
Mm-hmm. Right.
scientific questions can
Quite
address.
right. Yeah, it seems to me.
I
Go
do
ahead,
think
please.
that I now understand your question, and
Yeah, go ahead.
I do think it's answerable. The problem is that the moral sense did evolve, and as Heather points out, I wrote a paper on why. And the problem is that the why has it implies a troubling question. The why is that if we accept that morality is effectively synonymous or nearly synonymous with the willingness to sacrifice an opportunity, right? To bypass something in the interest of something else.
Yeah.
And the point is, well, why in evolutionary terms shouldn't you want everything
right.
that you want? You wouldn't want them if you didn't. So the reason is because you have different levels of success in tension with each other. And so
Yeah.
a society has moral rules, and we treat each other, we self-sacrifice for each other. Why? Because we get into the future better by doing so. But here's the bitter pill. The bitter pill is we get into the future better by self-sacrificing for each other's benefit in order to compete with other populations. And they do the same thing. And the problem is that ultimately this leaves moral goodness downstream of our attempt to defeat other creatures which have every right to get their genes into the future too.
Yeah.
And so the basic point is, okay, we have a moral architecture. Why? Because it's a mechanism for getting genes into the future. But we can now take that moral architecture and we can say, can we do something better with it, right? Having done something better with it, we end up somewhere in the direction of Buddhism, right? Where we say, well, how do we include everybody in the we so that...
Right, but again, why is that a good? I'm going around and around maybe. You're intuiting that as a good, that we all get in this as one, you know. Why is that something worth pursuing?
Well, but, you know, I think we started this conversation by saying that for some of us, we do not believe that you can ground the question of what is good ultimately in a mathematical or scientific reality. That we might be able to explain every phenomenon in the universe scientifically, but then we're going to have to decide which of those things we want more of and which we want less of, and that's not a scientific question. We will use scientific tools to inform it, but it's basically a preference, and preferring for more people to have the opportunity to do what we're doing rather than fewer people seems like a defensible position, but is it grounded in the fact that the universe needs it to be? No.
Let me make sure, because I want to get to your book. But I could talk to you all day about these grand issues, which I love, you know. And but let me say a couple. It's a book I loved, and there was so much in it that was thought-provoking and terrific. First of all, Chesterton's Fence, which plays a huge role. You know, Chesterton, for my Word on Fire family and team, is a major player. We've done a lot of work with Chesterton. And talk about that a little bit. So the importance of Chesterton's Fence and that image that you use a lot in the book. Tell me more about that.
Well, the idea is, basically, Chesterton's example is that two individuals are walking down a road and they encounter a fence across the road that appears to be serving no purpose, and one of them says, let's remove it, and the other one says, you can't remove it until you've explained why it was put there. Because, of course, until you've done that, you don't know whether it has outlived its purpose or you're just not seeing it. And so we encounter this now all the time, right? Because our way of existing on this planet is changing so rapidly, we are constantly faced with the question of, is this or that feature of our lives an anachronism to be eliminated, that we could be more efficient without, or are we going to discover what role it's playing after we've gotten rid of it? I mean, to take an extreme example, this fervor about defunding the police, right? Well, you'll find out what the police are doing, what effect they're having at a net level when you've gotten rid of them. And it's not going to be positive, but it's easy to imagine that it might be, because the level of crime in a world in which the police chase people who commit them, right, is comparatively low, right? If you've traveled to some place where policing has failed, you know that the effect is big. But if you only live in an environment where the police are mostly doing their jobs, you have no idea. So we can do that at every level, from physiological to social, and it's a crucial point.
So we talk about, for instance, some of the hubris of medical science in the 20th century, in which at the beginning of the 20th century there were a lot of doctors who said, well, clearly the appendix is not worth keeping, which we now know to be an error as well. But not only that, the entire colon, the entire large intestine is probably just taking up space we don't need. And so there's just this spate of surgeries to get rid of people's colons because Chesterton's Fence wasn't alive in people's minds, right? And similarly, we invoke, so Chesterton's organs, like the appendix and the large intestine, Chesterton's breast milk. Really? You're just going to replace that with formula because you think it's just food? Well, it turns out it's got immunological information, it's got communication, it's got the mother-child bond. You know, there's just a lot that is there. And just because you figured out one of the functions of the thing doesn't mean that you figured out all the functions of the thing. And of course, Chesterton's religion, Chesterton's gods, we invoke as well. You know, too many moderns overthrow all that has worked in the past in favor of the new. And often there is no new worth standing in for.
Well, we just appreciated the focus on Chesterton. Do you know Chesterton's wall? That's one I use a lot. Is you imagine a group of children at the edge of a cliff, like a precipice, and there's no wall around it, so they cower in fear. But someone constructs a huge, high, thick wall around the edge of the precipice. Now they have a ball. They play and they run. They bounce the ball off of the wall. And his point being, of course, you know, that in the name of freedom, let's tear down all restriction, tear down all moral law. Well, that leaves us cowering. But have these things in place, now we can actually play and enjoy life. So,
well, actually, the funny thing, though, is if you extrapolate from the wall, you actually learn something about modernity and wokeism, right? Because what we've effectively done is we've protected, as we say in the book, we've protected children far too much. And because they live in world that has been purged of risk for them, at the point that they face risk, they don't have the tools to manage it. And so they demand safety. They demand someone deliver them an adult analog of the world they grew up in, and it's impossible. It's not good for them. And yet we're tearing apart civilization over the demand.
You know, it's actually helpful, it's helping me think it through, because Chesterton insists it's kids he's talking about. You know, so let's say little kids learning how to play with the right restrictions, but then to reach the point in life where you say, okay, I can now on my own, without all the, you know, parental controls in place, I can actually learn how to play myself, et cetera.
Well, and this is,
Might
I mean, one of the big errors of moderns, I think, is saying, okay, I want the rule. Tell me the rule. What's the rule?
Right, yeah.
And maybe the rule is children should be protected. Really? All children? 1-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds protected in the same way to the same degree? Obviously not.
Right.
Right? You know, you protect a 1-month-old completely. A
Yeah, right.
1-month-old can do nothing on their own.
But a 15-year-old.
And a 5-year-old in, you know, in America versus in, say, Madagascar, where we have experience, has very different exposures. And the 5-year-old, frankly, is a more competent person than a 5-year-old, than almost any 5-year-old American. But we know, like, if you just think about it a little bit, you know that something magical doesn't happen on your 18th birthday.
Right.
And you're suddenly an adult,
Yeah.
right? It is a series of, it is developmental, it is evolutionary, and it requires the experience. Otherwise, we have, as we have too many of now, adults in body, but not in mind, right?
Well,
Who've
that's
been allowed no experience.
You two talk about this, and Jordan Peterson does too, the play between, you know, like order and chaos, and the hero's journey of going out from order into chaos, and, you know, bringing something back or bringing order into it, et cetera. And it's the willingness to be exposed to chaos and to be exposed to danger and so on that is key to that journey. And that one of the marks of the wokest thing is, look, just keep me safe at all times, and I'm not going to venture forth. We were saying before we sat down for the formal interview that, look, this cross I'm wearing here, we place Christianity at the center of our attention, someone who's dying on a cross. I mean, someone who's exposed to every possible danger. And how weird and interesting, really, that we hold that up for the contemplation of the world. It's not someone who's in a safe place, but someone who's very exposed in a very dangerous place. But the ultimate hero going into that, you know, and I would say bringing into it the grace of God and the love of God. But anyway, I appreciate that in your book very much, of how the wokest thing is affecting the psychology of our kids.
Well, the problem is we descended from people whose cultural traditions were a perfect match for their environment, or nearly so. And the lessons, the proper lessons, would automatically be acquired. And it was a dangerous world, but it was a world in which you could bootstrap your way to high levels of adult competence just by doing what seemed like you should do, by being cautious when you felt fear, you know, that sort of thing.
Right.
And we have removed the logic, and we haven't actually then noticed what that obligates us to do. And so as parents, we actually have rules for our kids that I think would sound strange to most people, right? So our kids know that we are not being ironic, we're not joking with them when we say, look, you are not allowed to damage your head, you can't damage your eyes, you can't damage your neck, you can't damage your back, you are allowed to break your arm.
Yeah.
Right? It's not that we want you to break your arm, and it's
And they've
not
taken
that
us up on this.
They've done
and it's not that we won't take care of you if you damage your eyes, but the point is, when you are doing things that put these things in jeopardy, you're taking on a whole other level of responsibility. And they also know that we believe the only way you're going to mature into an adult who can manage these things is if you have close calls and you process them properly. You don't think, well, it came out okay, I did the right thing.
You think it through.
Right, you have to say, well, if the only reason that if I stepped into the street and a car almost hit me, but it didn't touch me, the answer isn't I must have done something right. The answer is the only thing that protected me from death was luck.
Was dumb luck.
Anytime that happens, I've got a lot of thinking to do about where my error was. And, it does produce people who can navigate the world, but the problem is it's not built into our schools, it's not built into what we say to parents, and so we have just this level of learned helplessness at adulthood that couldn't avoid being a disaster at the point these people start voting and pushing institutions around.
Well, and it introduces risk. I mean, risk is the point at some level.
Yeah,
And so parents or schools that parent or educate this way will experience some tragedies occasionally. And those, I don't know how you recover from that.
Yeah.
We have been lucky. And yet, we argue, excuse me, that the societal level tragedy of raising whole generations of children who have not been exposed to risk, who don't have the capacity to navigate any of these things, is far greater.
Yeah.
And it doesn't leave the same kind of obvious death count. It doesn't leave the obvious bodies, but it is a bigger tragedy.
It's a bigger problem.
And so, I mean, again, maybe this is a problem of reductionism. You can easily point to a tragically dead child, and it's harder to point to generations of people who don't know how to navigate their own moods or bodies or decisions.
Yeah.
Right?
Let me raise a couple things here that, as I was reading your book, I'm thinking, yeah, church agrees with that. Yeah, that's the church's point of view. I'll name a couple. The issues of sex and gender. I mean, so making a certain distinction between them, but then saying, look, you can't talk about gender apart from sex. And that attempt has just been disastrous. I think we would certainly agree with that. I highlighted we should not interfere with children's development by trying to block, pause, or radically alter their development. Amen to that, I would say.
So obvious.
Also, the role of pornography in our society. I mean, it's just so apparent. You know, my generation, thank God, we didn't have the internet, and so people didn't get addicted the same way. But I know from dealing with young people for years, the vast majority of them, frankly, are addicted to pornography, and the hugely deleterious effect that's had on their lives. And of course, the church again says yes. And it seems to me that you would be making your own case for these things, but we'd be agreeing very much with the conclusion. So say a little bit about that. Like, why are you standing against these things?
Well, let's start with porn.
Yeah.
First of all, we have to draw a distinction, right? It's not that we are saying that erotic content is inherently bad, right? Erotic content obviously has a very long history, and in fact, our museums are filled with it,
Yeah.
right? What puts pornography in a separate category is the market influence over its content. And if you think for a second about what it is that people who produce pornography are doing in the market, they're competing with each other for attention.
Yeah.
And in order to get attention, when in fact what they're selling is just access to erotic content, they have to push the boundaries of what's acceptable in order to stand out in
Yeah.
that saturated market.
Right.
Now, the problem is, if you look at how ancient people came to understand what sex was, there was a lot that was by observation, right? If you're sleeping in the same hut with your parents and you're pretending to be asleep and they're engaged in something, you learn about how people actually sexually interact, as uncomfortable as that question may be. But if you then take a creature that is trying to figure out what the sexual world is, and what you give them as far as sexual content
pornography,
is
yeah.
pornography, in which the pornographers have been
Right.
in an arms race with each other, dipping
Outdo
into
each other
every
and-
taboo in order
Yeah.
to get attention, then people come to believe that this behavior is normal, and then they enact it on each other. And that could
Yeah.
hardly be more destructive of the kinds of relation. I mean, sex is an important part of permanent romantic relationships.
Yeah.
And for people to have been misinformed about what the nature of that interaction is supposed to be means that they are now not on a solid footing to build those relationships and to sustain them.
Yeah.
So it's
How about-
it's
go ahead.
dehumanizing and
Yeah, yeah.
reductionist again.
Right.
But it also pretends that that only the person who is observing the porn has any agency
Yeah,
in a sexual act, and I believe that. And I can't point to any data here, but
No, but
I believe that people who come into their sexual understanding by watching porn.
That's
are-
all about me. It's my
It's all about me,
pleasure,
and
my-
no matter what the person watching does,
Right.
cannot change the thing that is happening.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they are going to be, when they come to find what might be their life partner, that they have no idea actually what to do to actually come into relationship with that.
Isn't it true that statistically, like, young people are having much less sex than they ever did before, and they're having much more difficulty with sexual relations because of porn?
And
many
it is-
argue
and it
It's
is
not making them
absolutely-
happy.
it's not making them
It's
happy.
not.
Yeah,
The liberation isn't making them happy, and the pornography isn't making them happy. And the fact is, we've now been involved in this conversation for a long time because, of course, we had all sorts of students who were trying to navigate romantic
Yeah.
relationships, and we heard about these things. More and more, the recognition that whatever it is that people have been told they should want is not making them happy when they get it, that's dawning on people.
Yeah.
What they don't have is any idea of what they're supposed to do about it.
And it seems that it is increasingly the norm, that it
Yeah.
is, we have two teenage boys. And we hear from our teenage boys who do not watch porn, that it is, they are not believed in their friend group.
is that right? When they say
Right.
they don't watch porn, they're not believed.
They're not
Yeah.
believed,
No, I
and
believe that.
it is so normalized
Right.
that they that it can't come up that a girl that they might be interested in should want to know this, right? This should be something that any young woman would want to know about a potential partner.
Yeah.
But it is so normalized that even that you can't even bring it up, because bringing it up,
Yeah.
no, actually, I don't do that. That's not part of my life. Isn't part of a normal conversation. That itself would be strange. So that tells us that we are really far afield.
Aren't they starting to, like they're saying 11, 12 years old, like these very young kids start watching pornography?
Yeah.
So,
And their brains must be just wired then from that point.
Well, we set them up because we have
Yeah.
a culture that is obsessed with sex, in part because even in movies where that's not exactly what they're selling, it's still a mechanism to get people in seats. So we have a sex-obsessed culture, which means that kids are very understandably very curious about what this phenomenon is that
Yeah.
seems so powerful.
Right.
And then the answer they are given is completely misleading. And what they don't have are good models, right? Because to the extent that there are good models, they're more or less invisible and they don't
Yeah.
leave a lot of evidence. And they don't have any way of inferring what role sex is supposed to be playing, because it's something that humans are not very straightforward about discussing. So, we've given them effectively an unsolvable puzzle, and it's no surprise that they're not solving it.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me close with a question, because this struck me too very much. One of our principles, as I articulate kind of a word on fire, spirituality, is your life is not about you. And you have the line about this: the world is not about you, right? As a basic insight. Tell me about that as an important kind of moral insight.
Well, the first thing to recognize is that evolution is in some ways practical to an absurd degree. And what it has done is it has built us to be focused on exactly that range of phenomena that we can have some productive influence over. But it isn't scheduled to being a modern person.
Yeah.
That realm is set based on what an ancestor had power over. So there was no purpose in an ancestor worrying about whether or not that ancestor would have descendants 20 generations later, because there was no influence that ancestor had on what happened 20 generations into the future.
Yeah.
So they're focused on now, and they're focused on here. And now, of course, we have the power to alter whether or not there are people on this planet 1,000 years from now. And so we should be focused in this, but we're not. Our sense of what is important is built in a world we no longer live in. And what that means, if you correct for that distortion, that evolution has made us focus on the here and now because that was what was productive in the past, if you correct it and you say, well, what am I really?
Yeah.
Right? I am a very temporary custodian of something really important and ancient. And it is my job to do what I can to make sure that thing is still happening 1,000 years from now and 5,000 years from now. Well, it changes everything.
Yeah.
It changes everything about what you are. And it also changes your, it eliminates your solipsism. Right? Once you realize that you're a temporary custodian of something that if all goes well, will be here long after anyone remembers who you were, right? Well, then the point is that A, that's a lot of responsibility. B, it puts in context what we call the cosmic joke, right? You are in a very odd position as a creature with sort of limited deductive skills in a very complex, confusing universe, trying to make your way, simultaneously not starving to death, trying to figure out how to put your kids into a good position to thrive, right? It's a very odd thing to find yourself a person.
Yeah.
But it's you can do better with it and you can do worse with it, and that's kind of the question. Are you going to take what you've got and make the most of it without getting obsessed with the fact that you're not going to be here after a point?
Go ahead, Heather. Go ahead.
I mean, I concur. I think maybe the first time I remember thinking explicitly, the world is not about you, was in response to our students. We ran a study abroad trip in Ecuador for 30 students, and we took our children with us.
Those are great parts of the book, by the way. When you guys describe those trips, they're really very compelling.
Thank you. And it really is extreme. Talk about risk
Right. Yeah.
and embracing serendipity and exploration and figuring out what all is possible in the world, right? But one of the things that some of our students, we started to hear them saying was, another bad thing happened. We had a lot of close calls on this,
Yeah,
on
there
this
were
last
some that were
study abroad
extraordinary.
trip that we
Yeah.
had. And one of the things, one of the mantras that some people started saying was, nature's out to get us. Ecuador's going to kill us.
No, it doesn't care.
Exactly.
It doesn't care about us.
Exactly.
See, but in the spiritual masters, that's a very important move. In a lot of the initiation rituals, which, of course, we've lost totally, and to our detriment. But that's a major part of it, is to convince people nature doesn't care about you. That's why, by the way, worshiping nature, it never has a big high priority for me. I mean, nature, Mother Nature, whatever she is, doesn't care about me. She'd knock me over in a second,
And this is,
And-
it's a hard lesson.
It's a hard lesson, but a very important lesson.
It's absolutely critical, and I would say this. I got bad news for you. It's far worse than he, she, it, whatever is out to kill you. Doesn't care at all.
Right.
Which means you're on your own, but you're not, because we are here. So
Right.
we are here. We've created a community, and it's bigger. Make your community as big as you can, and know that self-reliance and reliance on those with whom you have come into community are what you've got.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's the origin of, the world is not about you.
Yeah, that's a good note maybe to end. We come to the end of our time, but I could talk to the two of you all day about all these questions, great and small, because I love how the small questions move to big questions pretty fast, and vice versa. So enjoy the conversation immensely. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks
Thank
for
you for
having
having
us.
us.
This was great fun.
Peace be with you. Friends, our first reading for this weekend is taken from the marvelous book of Proverbs. You can find that in your Bibles right after the book of Psalms. It's part of the so-called wisdom literature, so these texts that are more poetic in nature. Proverbs is associated with King Solomon, who's the paradigmatically wise figure in the Old Testament. It's made up of a series of aphorisms or brief statements, mostly about the moral life, although you can find some pretty high theologizing too. Go to Proverbs chapter 8, and you'll see reflections on Lady Wisdom, who was with God at the beginning when he created all things. And that had a good amount of influence on the later sort of logos speculation of the church. So the book of Proverbs, marvelous. It's a great book to kind of peruse. You don't have to read it cover to cover, but you can find wisdom in these aphorisms. Well, the reading for today is taken from the very end of Proverbs, from chapter 31, the final chapter. Very interesting how a book dedicated to wisdom ends with a kind of hymn of praise to a wise, industrious, resourceful wife. It ends with singing the praise of this marvelous woman. We could speak, if you want, of a kind of feminism within the book of Proverbs, since it ends this way, and Lady Wisdom is identified in Proverbs chapter 8. But I don't want to focus so much on that theme today, but rather on what I'd call a theology and spirituality of work. It's a theme that's very dear to St. Pope John Paul II, but one that we don't reflect on, I don't think, adequately. That work itself, in its various manifestations, is not something extraneous to the spiritual life, not something secular that we do alongside of our spiritual interests, but in fact is filled up with spiritual power. You know, when I was coming of age, I can't tell you how many times I heard this little adage. You know, it's not about what you do, it's who you are, right? It's not what you do, it's not doing that matters so much, it's being that matters. Well, I mean, I'll admit there's something to that distinction. Sure, I get it, you know. At the same time, I've always felt that distinction is simplistic, as though we can simply divorce our being from our action, our being from what we do, when in point of fact, I think our being is deeply influenced by our acting and by our doing. Work has a lot to do with the kind of people that we become. Again, another John Paul II theme. In our moral choices, he said, we make ourselves the people that we are becoming. And in a similar way, in the work that we do, we become the people that we are meant to be. Now, here's the first thing to think about now under this rubric. Adam, according to the book of Genesis, was given work to do, not simply after the fall, but before the fall. So there's a tendency to think, well, yes, after sin entered the world, then work is this kind of terrible burden. You know, we have to labor by the sweat of our brow, etc. Now, I don't deny for a second that work, like everything else in life, became worse after the fall. It became more difficult and complicated. That's true. However, remember, Adam was given work to do before the fall. Therefore, it belongs to what's good and beautiful and positive in our way of being human. Someone that was very prominent in our country some decades ago, the political commentator William F. Buckley Jr., once said this, and I passed this advice on to many people who struggle with depression. He said, industry is the enemy of melancholy. Industry is the enemy of melancholy. In other words, when you're feeling down, one of the great things you can do is get to work. Get to work on a project. It tends to make you feel better. Now, why? Why? Because work engages the powers. Think of your powers of mind, your powers of will, your powers of creativity and imagination. All of it is awakened when we give ourselves over to a project. I'll give you a silly example from my own life. You know, much of my life is kind of cerebral. You know, I'm preparing things like this, like a sermon. I'm writing an article. I'm going and giving a talk somewhere. Something I find really satisfying, no kidding, is doing the dishes. So especially during COVID, I've been home more often. And so I've sort of made it my responsibility to do the dishes after dinner. And you say, oh, it's kind of drudgery and it must be really tiresome. Not really. For me, I kind of enjoy it. Here's this big mess of dishes, and then through, you know, simple effort of my hands and so on, I can bring all that to order. There's something satisfying about it. Now, extrapolate from that to all these different forms of work that we engage in and how powerful they are, how much they awaken what is best in us. Think of it this way, too. John Paul II made this point many times. In our work, we become collaborators with God, collaborate, to work with. Could God accomplish all his purposes on his own? Well, yeah, of course he could. He's God. But God gives us the extraordinary privilege of cooperating with his work. He draws us into this activity so that we can, with him, bring about a greater world. Okay, Now, with all that in mind, that's kind of a general theology or spirituality of work. I want you to look at this wonderful passage from the 31st chapter of Proverbs as the author sings the praise of this industrious, intelligent woman. Listen. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. What I love about that, yes, she's working with willing hands, but she's also seeking wool and flax. No one's just handing her what she needs for her work. No. She goes out, with a sense of industry and purpose, and she finds what she needs. Like the ships of the merchant. How wonderful, this sort of exotic image of bringing goods from far away. Well, that's what this industrious woman does through her work. Furthermore, she rises while it's still night and provides food for her household. Think what it was like in the ancient world to provide food for your household. I mean, I can make my breakfast and lunch in a couple of minutes because it's all there. The eggs and bread and cold cuts and soup, it's all there. I just have to throw it in the microwave or in a toaster and it's done. But imagine now in ancient times when you had to provide food for your family. You had to go out and hunt it, or you had to grow it and you had to prepare it. So of course she's up in the middle of the night, every day working, engaging her powers for the sake of her family. How about this? I'm still continuing with this passage. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. Well, this woman's not just, doing manual labor. She's doing that. But she's a business person, going out there and looking at different options. She considers this field. She buys it. She invests. She's engaging not just her manual powers, but her intellectual powers. John Paul II is strong on that too. I couldn't help but think, with this great stress on hands in this passage, the work of hands and the fruit of your hands, one of my great heroes, Bob Dylan, has that marvelous song, Forever Young, that has the line, "May your hands always be busy, may your feet always be swift, may you have a firm foundation when the winds of changes shift." That's a deeply biblical idea. May your hands always be busy, engaged, active. Then how about this now? A different type of handiwork. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. How wonderful. The same hands that prepare food and work the fields are now reaching out to those in need. Perhaps it's the fruit of her industry that gives her the wealth that she's able now to share. That too, everybody, is a type of work, isn't it? Work on behalf of the poor. Terrific. She does that too. Then this. Her clothing is described, and it's described as being of fine linen and purple. That means it's a very high level. We'd say like it's a very fancy suit of clothes. But listen, but strength and dignity are her true clothing. Terrific, isn't it? So she is wearing fine clothes, but the real beauty of her clothing is in her strength and dignity. How does she become strong? Through work. Where's her dignity come from? From her work. Those who suffer with unemployment, and that's a curse in our society. What they feel is not just the financial burden of that, but it's the loss of dignity that people often feel when they lose their work, they lose their livelihood. That's where it comes from. Then this, not just physical work, not just investment, not just giving to the poor, but listen to this. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She also does intellectual work. John Paul II talked about, and he was a man that knew both manual labor when he was a young man, and then a lot of intellectual labor. Philosopher, a theologian, a writer, a teacher. He spoke about his desk as his intellectual workbench. I've always liked that because I do a lot of work like that. And when I sit down at my office at my computer, I often think of John Paul II's line. This is your intellectual workbench. You put in a good many hours of work on a sermon or an article or a book. What are you doing? Well, listen again. She opens her mouth with wisdom, And the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She does the work of the mind. Terrific, terrific. And then here's the wonderful coda with which the reading ends for today. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is fleeting. True, isn't it? Oh, that person's charming. Yeah, that could be deceitful. Maybe they're charming because they want something out of you. They're charming because they're playing a game. Beauty, we all know that, it's fleeting. Even those beautiful people, how long does it last? Not that long. But listen. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands. Let her works praise her in the city gates. You see what he's doing now at the end is correlating all of this wonderful work that this woman does. Intellectual, moral, physical, all this work by which she realizes herself. And he puts it now under the aegis of the fear of the Lord. Quite appropriate, quite appropriate. It's under God that we do the work which conquers our melancholy, yes indeed, but more than that, which awakens our powers, but more than that, gives us the dignity God wants us to have. So, in light of this beautiful reading, could I invite everybody listening to me now, when you go off to work, and whatever that is, I mean from doing the dishes to going off to your office in a high-rise building, to caring for your family, to intellectual work, I don't care what it is. But think of this now as collaborating with the purposes of God. See it as a spiritual act, a moral act, an act that brings you into union with the purpose of God. Well, good morning, everybody. It's my great delight to be able to address this National Catholic Prayer Breakfast, at least in this virtual way. I'm recording these words from an unusually overcast Santa Barbara, California today. Well, listen, you don't need me to tell you that we're going through a rather convulsive time in our national life. There are people bringing forward legitimate concerns about race and injustice, but others questioning the very foundations of our American political experiment. And some of the most iconic figures in our tradition, both civic and religious, are under attack. I mean, just recently there were suggestions made that in Washington itself, we take down monuments to George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. Just recently, a prominent member of Congress suggested we remove the statue of St. Damien of Molokai from Statuary Hall. And out in my part of the world, attacks on statues of St. Junipero Serra are very common. Well, what I'd like to do in the very brief time I have this morning is to step back a bit and give a wider perspective, and to show the relationship, the very important relationship between American democracy and a biblical view of the world. These two visions can and should come together. And I'll do it by looking very briefly at two figures, both under attack today, one in the civic order, the other in the religious, namely Thomas Jefferson and Junipero Serra. I think for Americans to think those two figures together is exceptionally important. Well, let's go back to that famously muggy, hot summer of 1776 in Philadelphia, where a young Virginia lawyer, he's 33 at the time, Jefferson was born in 1743, he's struggling to write the words to this famous document. We know them well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, here's what I want you to see, everybody. Though we take those words more or less for granted, they are very peculiar indeed, especially when you read them against the backdrop of the history of political philosophy. I say this now as someone who's taught political philosophy for many years, that all men and women are equal. That's self-evident. Go back to the classical political thinkers. It was anything but self-evident. In fact, it was self-evidently false. How are we equal precisely? In strength, in courage, in intelligence, in virtue? None of those areas. We're radically unequal. Now consult the great political philosophers of antiquity, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato. you'll find that their conception of the rightly ordered city is based upon a keen awareness of just how unequal we are. Take Plato, for example, the famous vision he has in the Republic, predicated upon a sharp demarcation between three social classes: the guardians, the auxiliaries, and the workers. All people equal? On the contrary, it's the inequality of the three classes, the acknowledgement of that, that's key to a rightly ordered social situation. Aristotle, Plato's greatest pupil, same thing. There are a handful of people, Aristotle thought, who were capable of public or political life, a sort of intellectual and moral elite. The vast majority of people, Aristotle felt, were not capable of it. In fact, some people were so constituted that slavery was their natural condition. All people are equal? Au contraire, I mean. And the acknowledgement of this inequality was key to the establishment of a right social order. So here's the interesting question. What happened? What happened between these classical thinkers and then this young 18th century Virginia lawyer who confidently says it's self-evident that all people are equal? The answer comes from those little words that tend to slide through our minds. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Unequal in intelligence, yes. Unequal in skill, yes. Unequal in virtue, yes, of course. But all equally children of God. Now, take God out of the equation. What happens? Well, I suggest consulting the tyrannies and totalitarianisms of the 20th century that operated on the assumption that God does not exist. Equality evanesces pretty quickly when God is taken out of the equation. Now, the second part of Jefferson's famous prologue. They're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Everybody? Inalienable rights? Would Plato have said that? Absolutely not. Aristotle? No way. Again, a handful of the intellectual and moral and social elite had certain rights and prerogatives. Vast majority of people did not. What happened? Why did it become suddenly self-evident to this 18th century lawyer that all people are endowed with these inalienable rights? Again, that little word that tends just to slip past our minds. Endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. God has given these rights to everybody. Mind you, the government does not give them, the state does not give them, the social elite do not offer them to a handful of their privileged friends. No, endowed by their creator. You know, something in George Will's book, his recent book on American politics, which I disagree with in important ways, but a part of it I like very much. Will said the most important word in that prologue is secure. What he meant was Jefferson's view that governments exist to secure these rights, not create them, not grant them, but secure them, rights that have been given by another. That comes, I would say, from a basically biblical view of things. Okay, so there's Thomas Jefferson writing in the summer of 1776. Now go to the west coast of our continent at the exact same time. In fact, 2 days before the Declaration of Independence was ratified, on July the 2nd, 1776, there was a Franciscan friar called Junipero Serra who founded a mission called San Francisco de Asís, 2 days before the ratification of the Declaration. From that little mission came eventually the city of San Francisco. At the same time that our founding fathers were putting together the principles of our country, this friar was establishing a series of missions on the West Coast. Just a word about Junipero Serra, born 1713, so a slightly older contemporary of the American founding fathers. From the island of Majorca off the coast of Spain. becomes a Franciscan as a young man, takes the name Junipero. His baptismal name was Miguel. Becomes a great scholar of the Franciscan theologian John Duns Scotus. And then at the age of 35, pretty old for the time, he decides to leave his comfortable academic life and become a missionary in the New World. He sets off knowing full well he'd never return, and he never did. Spends some time in Mexico, then some time working in the missions in Baja California, and then in his 50s, again, quite old for the time, he commences his career establishing these missions in what's now our state of California. He dies in 1784, buried in the beautiful mission he founded up in Carmel. Now, was Junipero Serra accompanied by Spanish military as he established the missions? Yes. And often those missions were accompanied by presidios or military establishments. But was he interested in the consolidation of Spanish political and military power? Absolutely not. Even the most cursory survey of his life shows that the dominant passion of his life was evangelization, was sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, which he took to be the greatest gift he could possibly give to the native peoples of this country. That was Junipero Serra's preoccupation. That's what fired his heart. You know, a couple of details. Do you know that in 1773, Serra made his way from California all the way back to Mexico City, there to argue for a kind of Bill of Rights for the native people, born now of his deep Christian faith, his deep sense that the rights of these people he was evangelizing should be respected. Another interesting detail, at a key point, the mission that he had established in San Diego was attacked, it was destroyed. And dear friends of his, fellow Franciscans, were killed by some of the native peoples. There was a rush to put these killers to death. Junipero Serra said, no. Preserve their lives that they might be saved, that they might hear the gospel. It's very interesting. You could argue that the first principled opposition to capital punishment articulated in the space of what is now the United States was precisely that statement of Junipero Serra. Now, here's what I want you to see, everybody. Even though there's no direct connection, obviously, I'm not arguing that, but there is indeed a very profound indirect connection between what was happening on these two coasts of our continent at the same time. Thomas Jefferson was able to say the things he said because, at least to a degree, now I know he's probably more deist than Orthodox Christian, but nevertheless, Jefferson could say the things he said because, at least to some degree, he had been evangelized. To some degree, he had heard the good news. What Serra was doing explicitly on the West Coast was in many ways the condition for the possibility of what Jefferson was saying and accomplishing on the East Coast. The coming together of the gospel and our democracy. That, friends, I think is a permanently valuable insight. You know, in 1831, so just 5 years after Jefferson died, a young French diplomat arrived on these shores, Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville examined the American scene. He had a great love for American democracy, a great respect for it. But he saw something which remains of permanent value to this day, namely, that American democracy will flourish only in the measure that it is grounded in a basic moral and spiritual vision of things. Take away the moral and spiritual framework, and American democracy will devolve in short order into factionalism or the tyranny of the majority. Valid in 1831? Mm-hmm. Valid today. Absolutely. Look at the two great social movements, one in the 19th century, one in the 20th. I'm talking about abolition and civil rights. How important that those two great social movements were led by people who had been deeply evangelized. Think of the leaders of the abolitionist movement in the 19th century. Think of those great heroic leaders of the civil rights movement in the 20th century. Both had been deeply evangelized by the Christian gospel. And so it goes with this relationship between what Serra was doing on the West Coast, what Jefferson was doing on the East Coast. So just a last thought, everybody. There's a tendency today, and I've noticed the last, maybe 30 years or so, to privatize religion, to turn the faith into something like a hobby, something we adepts whisper among ourselves. But this is repugnant to the nature of Christianity and what I'm suggesting, and is repugnant to the health of a democracy. A privatized religion is bad for religion, it's bad for democracy. So what's the best thing that we can all do? I think follow the promptings of the Second Vatican Council. The universal call to holiness. Bring your faith into the public arena this way, by being great Catholic lawyers, great Catholic politicians, great Catholic business leaders, great Catholic entertainers, great Catholic teachers, and not incidentally so, but essentially so. Resist the temptation to privatize the faith, but rather bring your evangelized self into the public forum. Good for religion, good for our democracy. Let's honor today both these figures, operating at the same time, late 18th century, one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast. Let's honor both Thomas Jefferson and St. Junipero Serra. And God bless.